Hello and welcome to Working Historians, a podcast series where we discuss what historians do with their lives. I am Rob Denning, Associate Dean of Liberal Arts for Southern New Hampshire University's online history programs. Now, we've been on hiatus since January with a couple of short updates here and there, and it's time to get back into the swing of things. As promised in our trailer for Season 2, we are going to interview new people, and we will catch up with some old pals. In this first episode of Season 2, my old pal Jimmy Fennessy and I are talking to Kate Schaefer, who teaches history at SNHU, about her research into female spies during the Irish Rebellion of 1916 and World War II. We talk a bit about the difficulties in conducting research on covert operations and on women in general. And then, because we were recording this at 11 o'clock at night, at the end we try to figure out theoretical CIA strategies for sabotaging Zoom meetings. Stay tuned. So what is your name and what do you do?
I am Kate Schaefer. By day, at least my job that pays the mortgage is I write proposals and I'm a proposal manager. But I like to say that feeds my soul is I do things history. I like to write and research history, and I also teach undergrad history for Southern New Hampshire University, who happens to be my alma mater.
And just full disclosure, Kate was actually a student in one of my classes at Southern New Hampshire University. Was it more than one class? I forget. It might have just been one.
I think it was both capstones. And yes, everyone, I live to tell the tale. It is possible.
Yes, I'm not that bad. I promise.
I mean, not everybody does, though. It is Rob Denning.
That's true. Yes, it's quite an ordeal. I like to throw whatever obstacles I can in the way of the success of my students because I'm just that dedicated to my craft. Okay, well, can you tell us a little bit about your academic, besides that, can you tell us a little bit about your academic and professional background?
Sure. Well, majored in history. I actually have, my family has a military history background. My dad and two grandfathers, and actually my husband, served in the military. So it's always kind of been an interest in mine. But it wasn't really until I started thinking about women in the military, how women serve and how that's changed, that I really wanted to start researching it more. I've been published in a couple places, one Historic UK, based on some of my research on Irish women in the revolutions. And then I've also been published here and there on women in the Special Operations Executive, and also Women's Land Army and the Lumberjills who served during World War II. To me, it's just amazing because it seems like there's so many more stories that you just peel back the surface and they're there. In World War II, you go into a bookstore, you go in a library, and there's shelves and upon shelves upon shelves, and then you'll see there might be two books of like women's contributions. Then a couple of years later, they'll find something else and there'll be more. It's just it's almost like the past keeps coming alive more and more as we realize more and more the players who haven't really gotten their fair due in the story. And I think that's what keeps me coming back.
Very cool. And so, as we mentioned a minute ago, you were a student in my Capstone Course. So you want to tell us a little bit about that project? What was the topic and what did you do with that?
Sure. Well, my topic was on women in the Irish revolutions, basically how they used their femininity and actually rejected it in order to be successful when they were acting as spies, as couriers. Some women ran guns with interesting impacts. You see through the history that women are just become or situate themselves in places where they're really not supposed to be according to society. And those kind of are the places where they begin to shine. One of the things like that I studied in the thesis was that these women, whether they dressed up as men or they dressed as women, people just completely underestimated them. And that was like their biggest power. It wasn't that their femininity was the reason that kept them from being considered, viable combatants and actual veterans after the war. But during the war, it was probably their biggest weapon and their biggest shield, because it was the thing that allowed them to act in, this space that was supposed to be male.
That's a great point. Just thinking through the names that constantly come to mind when you're thinking about I mean, not even just military history and revolutionary history, but even Irish revolutionary history. I mean, you've got the big names, right? You've got James Connolly. You've got Michael Collins, not the astronaut, but the other one. But what about people like, and I always mispronounce her name, Constance, is it Markievicz or
Markievicz? Yes.
Markievicz, yeah. How often does she actually? I mean, probably more often than not now when you're discussing it, but for a long time, how often did she pop up in the chronicles of Irish history?
And also when you dig a little deeper into it, it's how much were these women actually kind of covered up by, the forces or the groups that they actually supported. I mean, Elizabeth Farrell was the woman who accompanied Padraig Pearse to give the final surrender to the British Army after the Rising was fallen. And she was literally like airbrushed Stalin style out of the photograph, where there's a photograph where you see her feet and part of her cloak and dress, where she's standing kind of on the right side, like away from the camera. And then the official photograph that was, published in the newspapers, her dress and her feet are airbrushed out. It's crazy. It's just, of course, she herself later explained that she was happy for that to happen because she didn't want her presence to blunt the impact of Padraig Pearse. Of course, at that point he was the martyr, one of the martyrs of 1916. But I don't know, if that were me, I'm like, wait a minute, I was there too. What do you mean you just got rid of me? But yeah, I mean, it's strange. It's weird. I think more and more we are hearing the stories, but I mean, Markievicz we will hear a lot more of, but also she was rich and eccentric, which also makes really, really good remembering in history.
It makes for great stories, right? Not only in the historical annals, but also in historical narratives. It's was The Rising of the Moon, and I'm going to forget who wrote it, but it's this this historical retelling of what happened around 1916, and she plays a prominent role. But it's also historical fiction. It's nonfiction, obviously, but it's told in narrative form. So she plays, because she is so eccentric, or was, she plays a prominent role in that novel. But yeah, when you dive back into like the official histories, she does pop up here and there. But yeah, she's just such an interesting character too.
Yeah. I mean, her famous quote about telling women to put their jewels in the bank and to carry a revolver. Well, that's great, but what if you don't have jewels or an access to a revolver? I mean, it kind of cut some of the people out of the revolution. So, I mean, there were women who just were, come hell or high water, we're going to be involved. And I mean, they may not have been considered part of Connie's citizen army trained to be a sniper like Markievicz, but they were there. And whether they were abandoning people or carrying from spot to spot, they were acting.
So we've got a bit of class and gender going on there, all in one person.
Exactly.
So what got you initially interested in the topic?
Like all great academic pursuits, my love of Irish history actually started with a really mediocre Tom Cruise movie.
Oh, do tell.
I don't know. If you remember, there's a movie with Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman called Far and Away. There's really no redeeming history about it. I mean, honestly, there's only one thing that was real, and luckily that was the thing that kind of hits my wagon too. But there's one part where a character tells Tom Cruise's character about he calls it Captain Midnight, the Moonlight, the rebel code that they were using when the Irish farmers were trying to overthrow their landlords. Of course, I'm like, Captain Moonlight, that can't be real. I mean, nothing else in the movie is real, but it was. And it was just fascinating to me to find out that something that I saw in the movie was real. The more I dug into it, the more I realized about the famine, about the different types of revolutions leading up to 1916, then studying about 1916. And then kind of within the edges, you see the women that are there as well. Michael Collins, as we spoke of him before, I mean, he was the brains of the operation as far as guerrilla warfare during the Anglo-Irish War that followed the Rising. But he actually was very accepting of using women as spies. He saw the promise of these people that would be completely underestimated. So he had spies in Dublin Castle. He had women who were running safe houses. He had women who were collecting intelligence for different places and giving it to different groups and some of his colleagues. In fact, one of my favorite stories is there's a woman named Lily Marinin, and she was a typist in Dublin Castle. Turns out that her cousin was a pretty prominent revolutionary and knew Michael Collins. So they decided, well, she's in a pretty good place. Let's see what she can do for us. She was in a place where she kind of collected all of the water cooler talk and the bragging of like some of the British officers that came into Dublin Castle. And she just funneled it back to Collins. In fact, her intelligence is what was directly responsible for Collins knowing the identities of the members of the Cairo gang that were assassinated on a Bloody Sunday. If it hadn't been for Lily Marinin, that wouldn't have happened. And it's just amazing. It's amazing to me. I guess from very humble beginnings, where it came from Tom Cruise, but it gave me a way of looking at things that I hadn't thought of before, and that these were just very ordinary women in an extraordinary circumstance, but they were using what they had. Like Markovitz might have had the revolver and the jewels. Lily Marinin had some carbon paper and a pen. She had a typewriter. And I mean, she was able to change a lot of things. There are great stories about people. There's another fantastic story about a woman who is running a safe house where they believe that Michael Collins is going to take the night. The British police officer raided the house and decided he was going to stay because he had been tipped off that Collins was staying that night. So the woman told her mother to fake a heart attack. And, it's the kind of thing where it's like, Mom, do this. And literally the woman just drops like, oh, whatever. They call a doctor to the house. The doctor happens to be a female doctor who was involved in the revolution, involved in 1916. She's like, oh, let me see how she's doing. And they smuggle out a note to Collins in the doctor's bag when the doctor leaves so that he doesn't go to that house that night. So he escapes capture. And I mean, that's a great movie. That would be a fantastic movie. That would be something that I'd love to see. So, I mean, it's just great stories. It's just fantastic. It makes me think that if I were ever called to do something like that I might have the courage. I mean, I'm pretty sure I could fake a heart attack pretty convincingly, but I don't know if I could. I don't know if I could keep my cool. I'm pretty sure I might have trouble keeping everything together with that. But these women were brave and kind of stone cold in the situations that they were in. It was strength that I don't think anyone really expected.
I love that example that you just used too, because what you said earlier about Markovitz, not everybody had jewels and not everybody had a revolver, but there's a long history in Irish rebel history of just common people that would have safe houses and provide space for revolutionaries. The focus of my research was less the war and revolutionary period, and it was more Northern Ireland post 68. And you get a couple of prominent, strong female figures that play major roles. Bernadette Devlin is the first one that comes to mind. Not only key founder of People's Democracy, but also goes on to be an MP. And very outspoken, comes to the U.S., interacts with the Black Panthers and with the civil rights movement, and the cross-pollination of student politics at that point is really fascinating to me. But Devlin is such a major figure. But then all of the women in, for example, the Catholic areas that would have safe houses or provide passage for people who are protesting in the street, where they could just pass through the apartments and go into backyards and jump fences. It's like and a lot of them, we'll never know their names because they were just average people living that facilitated these opportunities, but didn't really, their name and their voices aren't out there.
Yeah. It's kind of like, I mean, this is a horrible way of putting it, but they're kind of like the grease that moves history. No, and everybody always really involved in like the main parts, the main engines and stuff like that. But without those people doing those small things, making that possible, allowing the space, letting people hide, passing over the information, just little things like that. That's how history moves. It's not necessarily these big names. It's not necessarily these big actions. It's this continuous movement that greases the wheels for change. It's just hard to put names and faces to
it. Yeah, that's the problem with the great man vision of history that people had for so long, is that you can have a great man, so to speak, but if there's not the other people in the room listening to that person, there's not much going on. That goes just talking to an empty room. So you got to have all those other people involved to actually get anything done. And so, do we know? So the specific women that you were talking about in your project, do you know what happened to them after the rebellion? I mean, like Timmy was saying, there was one that was elected to MP, but that's going to be later, in a later generation. But do you know, among the women that you were looking at, what happened to them afterwards?
Well, actually, Markovitz was the first woman elected to British Parliament. She refused to take her seat. Instead, she sat as elected official in the Irish Parliament, the Dáil Éireann. So, I mean, that's kind of another link to Devlin, where it's like, I mean, she was the first. I mean, they elected her, and she's like, yeah, no thanks. That's I'm not going to be a part of the enemy. Thank you for electing me, but I'm just going to turn my nose at it, kind of a thing. Lily Mernon, she didn't really want to talk about it afterwards. That's one thing that you see in a lot of the Bureau of Military History Archives, which is a fantastic online archive that I use. Some of the women, when they were asked about their efforts, like what they did during 1916 and then also in the following wars and Civil War, they didn't want to tell anyone. So many women applied for military service pensions for their work and were denied over and over and over again, despite having evidence of, this is what I did, this is how I aided the war, stuff like that. I was given, this rank, or what would be accorded this rank. So, I mean, you'll have these stories where they tell you what they did, and then you'll have a pension file that might be 6 or 7, groups long, where they keep putting in for information for a pension, and it's wild because at a certain point they're like, we're not going to tell you anymore. It's like, this, I would rather that it die than you to take my story when you're not even approving of me as an actual combatant. It's like, I fought, I gave this many years of my life for it. You want my story, but you're not actually going to give me recognition for what I did. A lot of them, it wasn't even a question of the money. It was just being recognized as being a service veteran. You kind of see a lot of that also with World War II, with spy women in wars and stuff like that. Of, it was great while they were there, and thanks for your help. But then afterwards, it's like, oh, come on, it was the men. They didn't really do that much. What's a nurse do in the middle? Or do kind of a thing. So you get a lot of issues with that, of women not wanting to tell their stories, and that's difficult. Then sometimes you have a case where they're not writing their own stories. So many times women's stories are told by people they left behind, who don't know the whole story, or by people who have their own reason for writing the history. Lily Mernon, it would be very easy to write that story according to several different, like historical avenues of, oh, she was this fantastic person who, aided the revolution. She was a revolutionary. Or it could be written that she was a pawn in Michael Collins' game. I think with not affording women the agency as historical actors also deprives them their agency as being historians in their own right. The fact that women have been told for so long that their stories don't matter, then why write it? Why expect that someone will read it? And I mean, I think that's really difficult, and it's very difficult for a historian trying to come up with that information. I think it was especially difficult when you going into the female spies in World War II, because then there's this also added level of, they were classified things that they were doing. So a lot of women never wrote down what they'd done because it was classified. They weren't supposed to say anything. And then they passed, and then we don't know what happened. So it's difficult. I mean, it'd be great if we had, I guess if we listen to women's voices more, maybe we'll have more of the historical record when people write. But I think we're still struggling with that today, even with something as recent as the early 20th century.
So one of the things that Jim and I have been trying to do with this podcast series that we want to do or start doing a little bit more often is actually doing kind of like a how did they do that type segment, whatever you want to call it. And so I guess that kind of leads me into something like that. So how do you reconstruct the activities of these women when they didn't leave behind documents like that? Like if they're not like you're saying, they're doing some sort of classified activities, so they're not taking notes of what they're doing, and then they don't do it later. So how do you, as the historian coming in, 70, 80 years later, how do you reconstruct that? How do you make sense of that?
Carefully. I think one of the best things I learned in grad school also is of being aware of what, like when you're looking at a source, what is their potential bias? What's their lens? How are they looking at this? So, I mean, of course, it's great if you have memoirs that people wrote. Virginia Hall had most worked with it was a spy. She wrote a book called Wolves at the Door. And that is fascinating, telling her story from beginning to when she accidentally shot her leg off to her, in the middle of France behind enemy lines with her wooden leg, helping the French resistance. I mean, she's able to tell her own story, so that's helpful. But then there's so many people that you only hear from hearsay. And sometimes that it's difficult to kind of, like you said, it's difficult to know where the truth is. For example, there was a special operations agent named Noor Inayat Khan. She was actually Sufi. Her father was a Sufi cleric. And she was a wireless operator for one of the circuits in occupied France. Long story short, unfortunately, her circuit was compromised. She ended up being tortured by French to the Gestapo, and then she was sent to Ravensbrück and executed. Well, you have these stories you have Noor's family telling the story, and then you have these stories of the people who trained Noor, talking about her background and what she did. And you see these mentions where one of the trainers says, yeah, we weren't really sure whether she was capable of doing this or whether she could really withstand the torture. Like, we really had a lot of concerns, and we really didn't think that we should have approved her to go. And the historian thinks, okay, well, I have this story where you're talking about the training of the special operations executive, where it's extremely tough, where people who are not ready are drummed out immediately, that if they do not think that you're ready for this, you would not go on with the program. And then you have the story of this woman who was sent overseas, was a successful wireless operator for a while being a matter of months, of course. But SOE life expectancy was measured in weeks, not years. But then her cover was compromised and she ended up being executed. So it's like, are you telling us that you had your worries about her abilities and her capabilities, like now that now that you realize that she's been executed? Is this something you're saying to justify what happened with her? You have to be really careful of, even within lots of different sources who are, appreciative of the work that the female spies did or that the women in SOE did. You have to make sure that you try to root out the bias, or at least recognize the bias coming from different sources who are putting in the different parts of the story. I think even though there are a lot of holes in it based on women who refuse to give information, but those military archives that I mentioned, the ones with the defense office in Ireland, it's fantastic because you'll see them written in the women's own writing. You'll see how they were answering the questions and stuff like that. And you definitely get a sense that even though memory plays a role, even though respondents' bias plays a role, even though, of course, they consider themselves the heroine of their own story, you kind of say, okay, well, this is something that I'm not going to take as the gospel, but if she's writing in her own words, these are the ones that I am going to put at least some faith in. That this is, if I'm going to tell her story, I need to let her tell her story, recognizing that she doesn't remember everything completely, recognizing that she's probably leaving out some stuff that she doesn't want her children to know, or that might make her look bad for the neighbor. I mean, it's difficult. I mean, we were talking about the great man theory. I mean, we have so many historical figures, Churchill, I mean, even Collins, where almost everybody remembers everything they ever said, and now it's on a T-shirt. Or you remember these great things that they said, but we almost have to go like spelunking to find what women did, what women said. So having actual women's words, I think, has been extremely valuable, and that's kind of what I've been trying to focus on with both the Irish spies and the spies in World War II.
It's such a great lesson in, historical sources, but also interpretation, and how you use sources and how you vet sources and understand them, right? Just so you can, even if you have a source that's a primary source, but written by a man, and you're using that source to get some insight into one of the female historical figures, that's obviously colored by whatever agenda that man has or whatever view that man has, not only of what the woman did, but probably also what role that woman had in society, or mentally what role he thought she should have in society. Whereas, and I really like the way that you said it, because it's something that, definitely we need to consider, and I probably haven't always considered too, is even when you have the primary source written by the female historical figure, what type of self-editing is happening there, what type of self-censorship, and what's being shared, and for what reason, what's being held back and for what reason. And as a historian, like, how do you take those sources and use them in conjunction with other sources to really start to flesh out a full picture, or as full of a picture as we could possibly get based on the sources that we have?
Yeah. I think another thing that I've had to is kind of check my own biases at the door. Going back to my, Tom Cruise roots of understanding the English-Irish issues. I think there's a tendency to romanticize the Irish during the Rising, and also during the revolutions and wars. But I mean, a lot of the things they were doing were not good things. I mean, Murnan assisted Collins, but it did lead to the murder of many people, and then the reprisal murders of many, many people. So it's interesting. Also, it's like you can't make them the heroines of the story, even as much as they would like to be. It's like they think they are the heroines of the story. There's another example, something I found in the archives, where two of the women who were actually in Common, which is the quote unquote women's wing of the IRA, where they were bragging that they heard about a woman wearing a Common uniform and trying to drum up intelligence, and they bragged about that they went and found this woman and removed her from that uniform and strongly convinced her to go away and never come back. And it's just like, okay, well, if I were telling that story and it was a man, I would think, okay, they're thugs. Great. It's like, you can't be subject to the same kind of bias and gender bias that society is you're complaining about the women being constrained by. I mean, women can do bad things as well, and that's fine. I mean, and historically, that's just a given. But you have to be careful that you're not making them out to be angels when they're not. I mean, I have this theory that society paints women as either mothers, angels, or whores. But as historians, you need to make sure that you're not pigeonholing them there as well.
Oh yeah, definitely. When we talk about prohibition, I live in a town in Ohio that was kind of the center of the prohibition movement back in the 1840s, 1850s, all the way up through the Anti-Saloon League in the early 20th century. And the prohibition movement was all about putting women up on a pedestal because, you don't want, as the thinking went back in the 19th century, women shouldn't be getting involved in politics because politics makes women dirty. It brings them down to the level of men. And, men, we believe already that we are scum, that we are dirty, that we get we're in the ditch, we're rolling around in the mud. Politics is a dirty business, but women shouldn't be brought into this because we don't want them to be sullied. We want them to remain pure up on this pedestal where they're not bothered by the frivolities of man, by the mudslinging that comes with politics. And so women shouldn't be allowed into the public sphere simply because we want them to remain pure. We want them to remain pure for the children, to raise good children, to keep the house clean. But women shouldn't be brought into the public sphere because they are a wholly different species almost that are deserving of being the purity must be maintained for women. And so I can certainly see that kind of carrying over to other fields like that too.
And yet they're allowed to use that purity to push through something like prohibition and prevent us all from enjoying whiskey.
A little bit of a conundrum there, but
women are powerful. Well, I mean, it's kind of like talking about, I mean, an Irish example. And when Eamon de Valera became president, one of the first things he started doing was rewriting the Irish Constitution. One of the amendments to the Constitution involved pretty much putting women back in their place in the home. That we should make it so women don't have to leave the house to protect their families and stuff like that. And to say that caused a couple issues with the women who were veterans of the revolutions was a little bit of an understatement. But I mean, that was another, it was like the last straw. Like, how dare you? We hope you win this country, and now you're putting us back, in the laundry. It's like, you wouldn't even be here if it weren't for our help. So I mean, it's strange. I mean, it's then. Sorry, I can get carried away with this, but
go for it.
Another thing is they also have news articles where people are referring to the Irish harpies, the revolutionary harpies that are poisoning society because they're supporting the Irish independence movement, and they're anti-religious and they don't dare spend time with them. They're selling your name. Like, okay, which one is it? Are we so fantastic and pure that you need to keep us in a box at home? Or are we these evil winged harpies that are ready to just completely destroy everything good about man? Or what is it? It's like this idea that you can be both things and then not having an issue with it. It's really outstanding. It's both mind-numbing and completely puzzling to me.
Yeah, it connects to that point that you just made about de Valera and the rewriting of the Constitution. I mean, here you have something that the majority of at least Southern Irish and Catholic Irish see as a positive thing, independence. But ultimately, what benefit did women take away from this independence, and how long did they have to fight for basic things like reproductive rights in Irish society? I mean, the benefits of that revolution were limited for certain people, especially women in Ireland.
And the cost of the question of would they have given so much had they known how little they would get in return? I mean, there are a lot of people that followed Connolly, particularly since he was the socialist, the idea of really including women. They really thought that there would be a different Ireland than the one that came out. Now, it would be a fantastic yet impossible research project would be like, what could Ireland have been had Connolly survived? Like his plans for what the Irish economy, the way that the political sphere should be set up, way men and women would interact in society, completely different than what actually happened. So it's like, was there a bait and switch where, women were raised on these ideals, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, those were great, but this is how it's actually going to work in the real world, kind of a thing. It's like, that did sound fantastic, and the brochure was wonderful, but this is what we're actually going to do. I mean, it makes you wonder. It really does. If people had that 2020 that we have now, would they act the same? Would they do the same things? Would it be as important to them knowing the outcome the way that they acted? I mean, when you have women who are throwing themselves into burning buildings and just, ducking under cover of gunfire on bicycles going from place to place in Dublin, when you have women that are helping blow up railway lines in occupied France, these are not the actions of people that are wishy-washy. These are not the actions of people who just couldn't find something else to do on a Sunday afternoon. I mean, this is something where it takes a level of courage. It takes a level of dedication. I mean, it takes a level of just throwing something into the wind. So it's difficult to know. It's always interesting to me that passion that occurs in wars and revolutions can be legislated out into something much smaller once, the dust settles.
And so you started talking a little bit earlier about the World War II experience for women spies, and so let's hear some stories about World War II. What was the focus of your topic there? What got you into it, and what are you going to do with that with those stories?
Believe it or not, Michael Collins is the connection to the World War II.
Okay.
So the Irish issues were kind of a burr in Winston Churchill's side for most of his early political career. Yet he was very pragmatic in that, he could accept that some people, even the people his enemies, had some good ideas. And one of them was Michael Collins. He admired, even though he didn't agree with it, he really admired the way that he used guerrilla tactics of fighting the British. He realized, like, yeah, this is really difficult. I mean, you really made things difficult for us when we're trying to, control your people. So when World War II breaks out, and Churchill comes from the idea of, well, we need to, set fire to Europe, set Europe ablaze. We need to have some sort of a regular force that is going to make sure that we can stay connected with France now that it's occupied. We need to send in spies, saboteurs. His idea of setting Europe ablaze was very, very similar to Collins' idea of making Ireland ungovernable. So you have a lot of the same kind of tactics. You have the same kind of the spycraft going on. And Churchill, I mean, God love him at least for this, he understood that putting women in the field was a good idea. Of course, not everybody agreed, and I'm sure Churchill had qualms as well, but probably mostly in how they would affect his political career. But they realized no one was expecting women in Europe. Men could not be reliable spies, particularly in France, because men were supposed to be fighting. And we also had the times in occupied France where they were making men go serve for Germany. I mean, anybody was being forcibly conscripted. So a man bicycling around Europe, around France, would automatically be assumed to be a spy, a saboteur, would be arrested, probably tortured. Women, though, on a bicycle could be going to visit their mother. They could be going to the store to get some bread. They could be any sort of just domestic things. They really wouldn't be suspected of any kind of criminal activity. So women went through same training as men in for the special operations executive. But the stories of how they got into it are very interesting. One woman, in preparation for D-Day, which now we realize it was preparation for D-Day, they asked people if they had any like vacation photographs or postcards of the French coastline. So please send them to us. They're trying to figure out, like, get a better geographic feel for where they could land D-Day. So one woman, she said, oh, okay, great, but she sent it to the wrong group. She sent it to the War Office instead of where it was supposed to go. Her name was Odette Sansom. She happened to have a French background, spoke French beautifully, had all these pictures, and they're like, oh, so you were raised there, and you're fluent and everything. So they brought her and started doing the training. Would you be willing to do this? She said, yes. So they brought women with different backgrounds. Usually they had to be completely fluent in French, but also accustomed to being, at least let me back up, at least for the F section, there were different groups of the Special Operations Executives going to different countries. So far, I've focused mostly on France, on occupied France and Vichy France. So for the women spies being sent to France, or potentially sent to France, they had to know French customs. They need to be able to just, kind of blend in to French society as it was. Not only being able to use the right verbs, something like that, but knowing what fork to use, knowing which way you look before you cross the street, knowing that you don't order this type of coffee after this time period because no one does that. That isn't done. Or, all of these little teeny details. So they had to have this kind of training. They also had training in weapons, both in weapons and also in fighting without weapons. They also were trained to withstand torture. They were given training of, sometimes they said that at one point they would be asleep and somebody would come in and just grab one of them. And that person, it would be like, this is what you can expect. They're just going to take you to a room, kind of see how you react, kind of thing. Anything, they were told, anything could become a way for the enemy to see that they were not who they were saying they were. Anything from the wrong type of buttons on their clothing to not addressing someone correctly, to, like I said, not using the right tableware at a certain time. They had to be perfect in how they were going over there. They had backstories they had to know. They had to know their own code names and stuff like that. But then they also had to be trained in what their role was. So in the circuits, it was, you had either a courier, a wireless operator, you had a leader, and women took on all three of those roles. The courier was a difficult role because they were on the move all the time. When you're on the move all the time, people can start noticing that you have patterns of travel, and that can make you more conspicuous. Wireless operator had to carry the wireless aerial with them everywhere, find safe places to put the aerial up and broadcast and stuff like that. They had to know how to very quickly code and encode and then into Morse code and back again. And of course, the leaders it was very difficult because the leaders knew the most people within other circuits, within some of the French resistance groups. So there was no such thing as an easy job. There was no such thing as a quote unquote women's job. All of them had to, they had to have the training of how not to be detected, how to protect themselves, and how to do their jobs. And then you add into it that these circuits were kind of isolated. They were acting on their own, even with the common objective. They were acting on their own. Then you have to get back into the fact that it was so dangerous that they pretty much knew that the chance of them returning was very, very, very slim. They knew that the children they were leaving behind, the families they were leaving behind, the fiancés, the husbands, the six mothers, et cetera, they probably wouldn't see them again. I think, like I mentioned before, like the life expectancy was measured in weeks, if not days, for wireless operators, for women in the Special Operations Executive, because there really was no such thing as Geneva Convention protections for spies. It was your spy, you're out of luck. I think if I wanted to go further, though, I really want to kind of draw connections between like the Irish spies and the World War II spies. I'd like to learn more about some of the World War I spies. In fact, there was a Sarah Aronson was part of a Nilly spy ring that was actually, it was fighting in World War I for the Allies, but it was also kind of also intended to help win a state for Palestine, win a homeland for Israel in Palestine. So, I mean, there you kind of see lots of different political mechanisms and everything in the middle of it. I just think there are a lot of connections that can be made, even you back to American spies for the U.S. Army and Confederate Army in the Civil War, women who were hiding things in their wigs and petticoats and stuff like that, to the women in World War II who, were actively sabotaging railways. It's like the thing that they have in common is that they weren't supposed to be there. But look at what they were able to do, even when they weren't supposed to be there. So I think that's one thing I'm really interested in is, how women were able to both use the femininity and use them being female as a weapon, as a plus, like as a bonus thing, as a tool. But then how it ended up affecting them in the end, how it affected how they were seen by their society, how they saw themselves, and whether it actually allowed their service to be recognized as, quote, good as male service.
Yeah, I think that would be a really cool larger project. You could start looking at other conflicts too. I'm thinking, and I'm drawing a blank on her name, but there was the Black woman who infiltrated the Confederate White House during the Civil War and was feeding information on some of the highest level discussions in the Confederate White House in Richmond back to Union forces. And kind of the same thing is that she was, a Black servant, a slave servant in a government building wasn't a surprise. And so she would kind of had free reign of the place. She would just go anywhere she could. Oftentimes, of course, in the South, slaves were seen basically as just a piece of the furniture. And so, they could kind of come and go, and they could collect all kinds of information and funnel it back through networks back to the Union forces. And so, I think there's probably examples like that you could really go into kind of all around the world in kind of really in almost all time periods. I'm sure there's got to be basically anytime I'm sure there's kind of an occupying force, there's always going to be kind of the civilians that are pushing back against that. Or in the case of World War II, if you've got British women being sent over to France, occupied France, then I guess they can be part of the invading force and occupying force there too. But you start putting civilians, and they can do some very important things.
Yeah. I think is another important thing to remember, though, is like it seems like in wars and revolutions, these gender stereotypes, these gender structures can bend to allow room for women to participate, but they don't break. They may not bounce back all the way, but they do bounce back. One of the things I studied actually at SNHU for the Russian revolutions was a story of Maria Bokareva, who is the founder of the Russian Battalions of Death, the all-women Battalions of Death, who jumped into the German lines at the German front after the men left to join Soviets after Lenin and the Bolshevik Revolution. It was great. They loved the fact that she was doing it. They loved the fact that she was on the front lines. Except, afterwards, when Lenin and Stalin couldn't convince her to start fighting for them, she ended up having a price on her head, and she was later executed. So, I mean, her service was great. She was a fantastic fighter when she was, benefiting them in that one case. But then afterwards, it's like, sorry, comrade, not going to work now. Like gender structures can bend, but in breaking so far, it's not a very good track record for them breaking.
Yeah, espionage is a dangerous career anyway. So it just makes it even more difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, I forgot to mention, there's a book talking about sources, it's like being careful with sources. Some of the ways that even the most, I hope, well-meaning people describe like the women in espionage. There's a book called "The Women Who Lived for Danger," talking about women who were in the special operations executive, and I'm like, that is not the title that they would put of a man who was in the special operations executive. They would not characterize his service as living for danger. So, it's interesting. I mean, of course, it was written in the book was written in the 1980s. There wasn't a whole lot of work done talking about women in the SOE, so I guess we should be glad there's anything at all. But you have to wonder, I mean, like, is that itself a product of that time? I mean, of the 1980s? Is that how we saw women spies? I mean, we think of James Bond, we think of Bond girls as spies. Well, James Bond actually came from the special operations executive. A lot of the inventions that Q comes up with, that Ian Fleming comes up with, were inspired by the special operations executive. So a lot of the, the weapons and gadgets that Bond used, chances are some of the women actually used first. So it's just this strange mix-mash of stuff. It's wild. I mean, there's so many connections, and it kind of makes your head spin to see how we kind of double over each other in explaining why things have to be a certain way, even when they're proven to be a different way.
Yeah, this is a lot of good stuff. So I'm hoping. I know that you mentioned that you've published a few article length things, but I'm all on board with you just going all out on the book and see what you can collect. I want this all in one place.
Yes. I would too.
Yeah. All right. Well, this is a really cool topic, and I look forward to seeing what you do with it in the future. For now, let's talk about our recommendations. So, Kate, what would you like to recommend to the audience this week?
Well, going along with the topic, there's a new book by Sarah Rose called DDay Girls. It's a great introduction to the special operations executive, and it really delves deep into several women that I spoke about, but also about how these women helped kind of lay the groundwork for D-Day, something we kind of think is this just totally done like by Eisenhower, all these generals and stuff like that. But it was a lot of things that were happening on the ground of sabotaging railways, figuring out where things were, keeping communications going, that actually paved the way that helped it happen. So I thought that it's very interesting. It's rather new. I think it's in paperback now, but it's DDay Girls by Sarah Rose.
Very cool. Let's move on to Jimmy. What do you have for us?
All right. Well, as you know, a lot of my recommendations tend to connect to history and popular culture. The one I have today is Trevor Ristow's Waiting for Another War, A History of the Sisters of Mercy, Volume 1, 1980 to 85. So I got this book as a Christmas present, and I've started reading it, but haven't made it all the way through. So I'm no spoilers because I know the band. I don't know where the book ends and where Volume 2 will begin. It's pretty fascinating. There's a lot of great insight into the music scene in Leeds at the time when Sisters of Mercy were forming. Some great visuals. And just, if you are into the origins of goth music in the 80s and some really intense songs by a great band, Sisters of Mercy would be the way to go. And Waiting for Another War by Trevor Ristow is a great introduction to them.
Oh, very cool. All right. I was going to actually do something else, but the conversation about spies and all that got me thinking about this other thing that it was in the news, I don't know, a year or two ago because it got declassified by the CIA at some point in the recent past. Anyway, it's a document from 1944 from the Office of Strategic Services, and it's called the Simple Sabotage Field Manual, which is a document. It's 36 odd pages of ways that somebody can subvert, you basically sabotage countries organizations, companies. Basically, you can go in and sabotage anything. And this is something that supposedly the CIA was handing out, the CIA's predecessor, the OSS, was handing out to people as basically an instruction manual for how you go out and throw monkey wrenches into organizations. Presumably this is probably going to be like Nazi meetings, communist meetings, that kind of thing. But the page that jumped out at me, which I'm just going to read some of the stuff from this page because it's really amusing, but it's the general interference with organizations and production. And there's section A, because it's a government manual, so it's therefore divided up by numbers and sections and paragraphs and all that. So this is section 11, part A, for organizations and conferences. And it's just a list of things that you can do to sabotage conferences and meetings and presentations. And so the things that they talk about are things like, number one is insist on doing everything through channels, never permit shortcuts to be taken in order to expedite decisions. 2 is to make speeches, talk as frequently as possible and at great length, illustrate your points by long anecdotes and accounts of personal experiences, never hesitate to make a few appropriate patriotic comments. Number 3, when possible, refer all matters to committees for further study and consideration. Attempt to make the committee as large as possible, never less than 5. Number 4 is bring up irrelevant issues as frequently as possible. And there's haggle over the precise wordings of communications, minutes, resolutions. You want to refer back to matters decided upon at the last meeting and attempt to reopen the question of the advisability of that decision from the previous meeting. You want to advocate caution. You want to be reasonable and urge your fellow conferees to be reasonable and avoid haste, which might result in embarrassments or difficulties later on. You want to be worried about the propriety of any decision. You want to raise the question of whether such action as is contemplated lies within the jurisdiction of the group and whether it might conflict with the policy of some higher echelon. It's just basically this is every department meeting just boiled down into one page of everything that, especially in academia, this is the stuff that people do, not intentionally sabotaging it, but this is the way every meeting goes. There's always these people that do this kind of stuff, and it's just really funny to watch it laid out in a sabotage manual from the
half of those talking points also sound like tactics utilized by the new Republican Party.
Yeah, there's a whole other section here about interacting with managers and supervisors. 1 is that you demand to have everything in writing. 2 is you misunderstand all of the orders, ask endless questions, or engage in long correspondence about those orders and then quibble over them when you can.
Brilliant.
Welcome to the U.S. military.
Yeah. So I'll post a link to all of these sources in the episode notes here, but everyone can go check out the Office of Strategic Services simple sabotage field manual to
Fantastic.
Go out and throw monkey wrenches into every organization you can.
Will the 2020 edition include keeping yourself on mute so that people have to tell you you're on mute several times?
If there isn't an updated version of this, it's probably, the CIA, I'm sure, has probably updated this since 1944 and it's probably classified away in their vault somewhere, but we can certainly make up our own and start adding in Zoom etiquette.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that there is a whole Zoom section in the new one.
There would be, yeah. And that consists of, can you guys hear me? Can everybody hear me? Even if you can you hear me? Yeah. Am I all alone here?
Yeah. Did they say that they were joining? Wait, I'll text and see if they're joining. Did they say they're going to join? It looked like they accepted the invite. Did they accept the invite?
Yep. Typing in the chat, I'm having technical difficulties. I'm going to have to restart.
Yeah.
Is Jimmy here? I don't see Jimmy. Jimmy,
Jimmy,
are you there?
Mute. Yeah, Jimmy, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Oh, now your camera's off. Yeah. Oh, look, someone's cat's in the background. Yeah, that's the kind of stuff that throws off meetings today.
Is that your daughter?
Yeah.
Where were we again? Oh, let's check the meeting.
No, it's funny that kind of along that I have a SOE manual that kind of goes through the same thing, where talking about like how to fit into, how to kill someone with one finger, that kind of thing. I had my doubts as to whether that was actually something that was actually given out to people though. So that's interesting. But yeah, it's kind of hard to believe that when the same group that gave women like a cyanide pill in case they were caught would also give them a very nicely bound version of this is how to do your job. interesting.
Yeah, I have no idea how, if this field manual that I was talking about, I have no idea how often it was handed out to people, if it ever was handed out to people. I have no idea, but it was just something that came out of the declassification process at the CIA, and it's just funny. So I like to keep it bookmarked just so I can go look up how to sabotage meetings.
I would love to know how long it took them to come up with that. Like, did you know that there was somebody doing all those things while they were discussing it? How long could it possibly have taken?
Yeah.
Oh my God. Yeah. The calling, it's basically a call for papers where you're calling for people to send in their suggestions for how to sabotage meetings. Oh my God.
Or it was just based on this one guy in the OSS who was just an absolute dick. And it was like, just think about how Joe interacts in these meetings, write everything down that he does, because it's infuriating and we never get anything done. This is the way to sabotage any meeting.
It's either that or, two low-level analysts who had nothing else to do with their day who were just laughing and typing this up. So
yeah,
there's lots of possibilities for the provenance of this document here.
Fascinating.
So on that note, thank you for joining us tonight, Kate.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. It was great.
And thank you all for joining us today. This episode appears on the Working Historians podcast feed, and you can subscribe to that feed on any podcast app, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Lyceum, Podbean, or whatever else you prefer. That way you won't miss any episodes, and you'll continue to hear all the other cool stuff that historians do with their lives. If you have any questions or comments for this or any of our other podcasts, please send us a message to workinghistorians@gmail.com. Follow us on Instagram at Working Historians and on Twitter at Work Historians. For Kate Schaefer and Jimmy Fennessy, I'm Rob Denning. Take care of yourselves and each other.